to another episode of our fun dive into fairy tales. Today, as you can see, we will be discussing royalty of the underwater kind. Today is our dive, no pun intended, into Hans Christian Andersen's masterpiece for the ages, The Little Mermaid. So, The Little Mermaid was written by Hans Christian Andersen in the year 1836 and was first published on the 7th of April 1837 in a collection entitled Fairy Tales Told for Children, and was consequently republished again in December 1849 and yet again in December 1852. Hans Christian Andersen was heavily influenced by another tale by the name of Undine, which is another tale of a mermaid wanting to marry a human, and published in Germany in the year 1811, 25 years before The Little Mermaid was actually written. It was by a man named Frederick de la Motte Fouquet. I did not swear just then, and deserves a video all of its own. Undine, in its turn, was inspired by the works of famous occultist Paracelsus, who originated the term Undine as a category of elemental beings associated with water, and first appears in the year 1566, 270 years before The Little Mermaid was put to paper. Now, Hans Christian Andersen's working title was not originally The Little Mermaid. It was instead entitled Daughters of the Air, which are elemental beings who can earn their souls by doing 300 years' worth of good deeds. And as with most fairy tales at the moment it was written, it was intended for adults, not for children. Now, the events at the end of this tale has caused quite a bit of debate over the years, as you can probably expect when we get there, or unless that you know the end already. And as I'm sure you'll understand, this is because it is not a happily ever after. Most fairy tales are not a happily ever after. Now, before I dive into the media aspects, if you want to skip that and go straight to the story, go to this timestamp here, and then you miss my rant. So the tale of The Little Mermaid has been adapted into so many branches of different media, including ballet, opera, film, theatre, and animation. Of course, the most popular of these to date is the Walt Disney animated film in 1989, and my personal favourite Disney film to this day, which is only loosely based on the original tale, as the original work hardly met with the Disney standard for films to appeal to children, bring in money, and to always have a happy ending. So there's the first film. The second film, no, not so good. And the third film, I bought only because it goes with the rest of them. And I still have the original cassette. I mean, nobody even buys these anymore. Look at it. Now, for you new people, and apart from us old ones, this is a VHS. I didn't even rewind it. I'm an absolute Philistine. But this is what we used to watch films on. And I've only kept it. It's the only one that's survived out of the Disney films that were on video that I've actually kept, just purely for nostalgic reasons. I'm pretty sure it came with a poster, but I don't have that anymore. Now I'm going to have a little break. I'm going to come back to you. I am going to re-watch the trailer for the upcoming live one, and you're going to get my reaction to it afterwards. Because it's my favourite, I think I'm going to be a bit more critical than I would usually with the live actions. With most of the other live actions, I haven't even bothered watching them, because they're just, I mean, The Lion King isn't even really, why is that, I'm not even going to get into it. The above water, what I will say is Halle Bailey has a magnificent voice. The singing, it's just a little bit of it at the end, but I get chills. I really like her voice. That voice is Ariel. But Melissa McCarthy as Ursula? Really? I hope to God that in the actual film it does more than the trailer shows, because the trailer makes it look like she's like Ursula's a parody on Saturday Night Live. And the fact that Melissa McCarthy is a comedic actress, Ursula is not a funny character. She is evil, she is vindictive, she is petty, and she is sassy. And I swear to God, if they butcher the poor unfortunate souls segment, I'm going to be so just not even angry, just disappointed. Because the poor unfortunate souls is one of the best villain songs, Disney villain songs of all time. It is sinister, it is fun, and she looks too human to be Ursula. It looks too bright. That whole scene of Ursula persuading and manipulating Ariel into signing that contract is fun, but it's fun but not funny. And that whole scene, even in the animation of the magic and Ariel getting swept up and the hands reaching down her throat and ripping out her voice box, even for Disney, it was dark. And that's what made it that darkness. So I hope to God they don't butcher it. I mean, the scenes on land, the scene of the ship getting... The scene of the shipwreck is amazing, but let's face it, they've had enough practice with all the Pirates of the Caribbean films to get a shipwreck right. My second gripe, apart from Melissa McCarthy playing Ursula, is the look underwater. It looks dreary and dismal for the most part, and there's no bubbles. I mean, it's probably a strange thing to get hung up on, that there's no bubbles, but even in the Pirates of the Caribbean, I can't remember if it was the fourth or fifth one, where they had mermaids, there was bubbles. In the animation, there was bubbles. Underwater, in anything, there is bubbles. Even Titanic had bubbles underwater. And that's what I feel. It's like it's been rushed. And I really hope that it doesn't... I really hope that the feature film doesn't feel rushed or look rushed. I don't know whether I'll be going to see it yet or not, or wait till it comes out, or even wait until it goes on TikTok, because I mean, you can watch a whole film by scrolling on there. Now, with Disney live actions, I feel each live action that they've done is quite a Marmite moment. You either love it or you hate it. The ones that I find, for me, that they've done well is where they don't do a carbon copy of the animations. They take bits of the animations and bits of the original story and mishmash it together to have a finished film. Like Maleficent is a great example of where they've done that perfectly. It's not a Sleeping Beauty tale. It's more focused on Maleficent instead of Aurora, but it works. And Cruella did it really well as well. Mulan, not so much. And The Lion King, no. When they get it right, they knock it out the park. When they get it wrong, it's like a dumpster fire. One thing I would like them to do, and that's just because I like the darker aspects, is for Disney to have the animations over this side and do live actions. But if you're going to do live actions, do the originals. And I mean the proper originals. Make them gritty. Make them for adults. I mean, Disney is all about money, of course, but what I would like is, I mean, not even just Disney, it's just for a studio to make a live action original fairy tale. I mean, there's enough action, gore, funny moments, romance. If you get the right one and you get the right studio, I think it'll really, really work. And that is my rant. I am going to wait to see it before I criticise it more, but just from the trailer, I know that on TikTok people keep talking about Halle Bailey as Ariel, but I don't even I think this is her first film and her voice sounds really, really good. My hang-up is, as I said, Melissa McCarthy as Ursula. She just doesn't give off the menacing vibes to me that I think Ursula needs as a top-tier Disney villain. But enough of my rant, let's get back to it. Now, Hans Christian Andersen's tale of The Little Mermaid became so popular that there's even a statue of her in Copenhagen, Denmark, where the tale was first written and published, which was unveiled in 1913. It was commissioned in the year 1909 by Carl Jacobsen, who was the son of the founder of Carlsberg. Fun fact for you there. He had become fascinated by a ballet about the fairy tale and even asked the ballerina to model for the statue. She agreed, but only her head could be used as a likeness as she refused to pose in the nude. The sculptor instead used his wife to pose for the body, and now there are 13 replicas of the original statue which can be found around the globe. This is how popular this tale is, even before Disney got a hold of it. So, with that being said, let's get into the story. The tale opens describing the blue of an ocean as clear as glass and deeper than anyone can imagine. At the deepest part of the ocean rises the palace of the Sea King. The walls were made of coral, the windows of clear amber, and the roof was made of mussel shells which opened and closed with the tides, revealing magnificent pearls inside which shone. The Sea King was a widower, and his mother looked after the palace and ran the court. And due to her royal rank, she had 12 oysters attached to her tail, whereas the other ladies of the court were only allowed 6. She was especially fond of her 6 granddaughters, not 7, and she was especially fond of the youngest. Her skin was as soft as a rose petal, and her eyes were the deepest blue that the ocean could find. And the sisters spent the days playing in the palace and petting the fish. Now, each princess had their own garden in the palace grounds, which they could decorate as they liked. One had a flower bed and shaped it like a whale. Another shaped it like a mermaid. The youngest made hers into the shape of the sun that always fascinates her whenever she looked towards the surface. Now, while the others decorated theirs with flowers and trees and items from shipwrecks, she only allowed flowers in hers and the white marble statue of a young boy. Now, the youngest mermaid, she never gets a name. Disney gave her the name Ariel, but in this, they never have names. She's just described as the Little Mermaid or the Youngest Mermaid. And she was constantly wanting to hear about the world above. She wanted to know about the cities, the people, animals, the whole environment, the whole thing absolutely fascinated her. Like some humans are with outer space, something that is barely reachable. The rule at the court was that only when the princesses turned 15 could they go up to the surface. And the process would begin the next year when the eldest sister turned 15. So this story begins with the youngest one being around the age of 9 or 10. Now, when the eldest sister's turn came round, she went to the surface, and when she came back, she told her sisters all about it, and the little one was listening intently, as she told about her new favourite thing, to lie on a sandbar in the moonlight and to gaze at the large city on the shore, to hear the ringing bells, the music, the laughter, to hear the people going about their business, and she wanted to join them more than anything else. But, being a mermaid, she couldn't, so when she dove back down, she told her sisters all about her experience. For the second sister, she went to the surface at sunset, and was amazed at the golden glow of the sky and the clouds, and there was a flock of swans flying towards the setting sun, and she too tried to chase them, but it went down below the horizon, and as the glow faded, she dove back down again. The third eldest sister was the boldest out of the 6, and when it was her turn to go up to the surface, she swam up a river and into the mountains. She saw green rolling hills, woods, palaces and houses. She listened to the birds, and she found a group of children playing outside a cave. She wanted to play with them, but as soon as they saw her, they were scared and ran away, and the dog that was with them began to bark furiously at her, and the mermaid was scared and swam back down the river and to the open sea. The fourth eldest sister was the shyest of them all. Usually you think it's the youngest one, but in this one it's the fourth one. And she didn't go anywhere near the land. She didn't want anything to do with the land, with humans, any interaction at all. She stayed out with the rough waves where she could see all around her, and the sky looked like a dome of glass. She saw faraway ships on the water, and she played with dolphins and whales until it was time to go back down. The fifth eldest sister had her birthday in the wintertime and saw things that the others had not. The sea was green, and enormous icebergs floated around and sparkled like diamonds. She seated herself on the largest of the icebergs, and all the ships which sailed by sped up as soon as they saw her, for the sailors were scared when they saw her sat on the iceberg with her hair blowing in the wind. And as they saw her, thunderclouds rolled in, the sky flashed, thunder rolled, and the ships were tossed in stormy waves, but she just sat on the iceberg and watched the lightning strike the sea. Now, each of the sisters at first delighted in going to the surface, but because they could do it so often and it became a bit repetitive, they soon became bored of it and would hardly go up there anymore. They said they would become homesick and that there was really no place like the palace under the sea. Now, on many evenings, all 5 would hold hands and rise to the surface when they knew that a storm was brewing and they anticipated a shipwreck. They would swim around the ship and sing seductively of how beautiful it was at the bottom of the ocean. And when the ship went down, the sailors drowned, and it was as dead men that they were taken to the palace for decoration. Now that screams to me sirens, not just happy little mermaids. They were doing it deliberately. And on these nights, the youngest sister had to stay home as she was not yet 15, and she wanted to cry, but mermaids have no tears and cannot cry, and she longed for when she would turn 15 and finally get to experience the world which she had dreamed about for all of her life. At long last, the little mermaid's birthday finally came around and she turned 15. Her grandmother put a wreath of white lilies in her hair and 8 oysters fastened to her tail as a sign of rank. It hurt, but her grandmother insisted, and it was done to keep up appearances in their court. She was a princess, after all. As she rose to the surface, the sun had just set and the clouds were golden and the stars were just beginning to sparkle. The sea was calm and the air was fresh. And as she looked around, she saw a great 3-masted ship riding on these calm waves. There was music and singing, and as darkness came, lanterns of many colours were lit, as it was a party. The little mermaid swam right up to the main cabin, and as the waves rose and fell, she could look inside and see all the wonderfully dressed people that were congregating inside. But the handsomest of all was a young prince who stood in the middle. They were celebrating his 16th birthday, and as he went out on deck, fireworks lit the night, and the mermaid was mesmerised by the sight of falling sparks, or stars, falling all around her. It got very late, but the little mermaid did not want to leave the fabulous sight and the fabulous party and the handsome prince which she had just seen. But as the lanterns were put out and the music finished, there was a rumble down in the sea, and the wind began to howl. The waves grew high, clouds rushed in, and lightning flashed in the distance. The ship was tossed by angry sea, and the waves rose up like black, ominous mountains. There was a loud creaking, and the mast snapped in two like a twig, Thick timbers gave way, and waves broke over the ship, bursting into the hold. Now the little mermaid saw that the sailors were in deadly peril, and she herself was in danger too, and must avoid the increasing wreckage thrown by the sea. She watched closely for the prince, and when the ship split in two and she saw he was thrown into the ocean, at first she was overjoyed, because he would now be with her underneath the waves, until she remembered that human men could only reach the palace if they were dead. And of course that was no good to her at all. She couldn't stand thinking that it was only as a dead man that she would be able to live with him underneath the waves, and she dived through the waves until she reached the prince, who was now unconscious. His arms and legs were limp, and his beautiful dark eyes were closing, and had the little mermaid not rescued him, he would certainly have drowned in that storm. She held his head above the water and let the waves take her where they would. At daybreak the storm was over, and not one part of the ship remained. The little mermaid kissed the prince's forehead, and she noticed in the sunlight how much of a resemblance he had to the statue of the marble boy which she had kept in her garden all these years. She kissed him again, and she hoped that he would live after this ordeal. She finally saw dry land in the distance, and close to the beach was a church or a convent, but a building meant people, and people meant rescue. She swam with him to the beach and stretched him out on the land in the sun, taking care to pillow his head on the warm sand. When the bells began to ring, a number of girls came out into the garden. The little mermaid swam away to hide with some rocks, and she placed seaweed in her hair so that they wouldn't see her. And she watched and she waited to see if they would find the prince laid out on the shore. Eventually, one of the young girls spotted him, and she ran to see if he was still alive. She seemed frightened, but called for other people to come and help, and the mermaid watched from her hidden place in the rocks as the prince regained consciousness and smiled at everyone around him, especially the first girl, which was leaning over him. But he didn't smile at the mermaid, as he didn't even know that she was there. Now the little mermaid felt very unhappy, and as she watched as the prince was led into the building away from her, it was only then that she dived back down to her father's palace. Now her other sisters, when they had gone up to the surface, they only stayed maybe a few hours and then dove back down. She had been gone for an unknown time. She went up just as the sun was setting, and it was now fully the next day when she actually arrives back home. And when her sisters asked what had gone on, she wouldn't say, and she remained even more quiet than she was usually wont to do. Now on many evenings and mornings she revisited the shore where she had left the prince, but she never saw him again, and with each passing day where she didn't see him, she grew more and more miserable. Until one day she couldn't stand it any longer and told one of her sisters what had happened on the night of the storm, the shipwreck, saving his life, taking him to shore, and losing him. But of course, as this was prime gossip, the sister didn't keep it to herself. She told all the other sisters, and the other sisters told their friends as well. There's nothing like a bit of misery and depression to, share it about a bit. Now, one of these friends knew which prince she was talking about, because I'm assuming there's many, many, many that they come into contact or don't come into contact with. But one of these friends knew who this prince was. She knew where he lived. She had seen the party on the ship that the mermaid had been, and she had skedaddled when the storm first started brewing. So that night, all the sisters held hands, rose from the sea to where the prince's palace was. It was built of glistening golden stone, and a great marble staircase led down from the palace directly to the sea. Now that the mermaid knew where the prince lived, she went there every evening. She went closer to the shore than any of her sisters would dare, and some nights even swam up the little river by the palace, and which went under the prince's balcony, so that she could watch him in the dark and hear his voice. And on many nights, when the fishermen came out for the dawn breaking in the morning, they would talk about the young prince and how kind he was and how easy he was with them. He wasn't aloof, and he wasn't He wasn't a dick, basically. And it made her proud to think that it was her that had saved his life. Without her, this wonderful, kind person would be dead. But that made her increasingly unhappy because he didn't have a clue that she existed. She thought of how softly his head had rested on her shoulder, how tenderly she had kissed him, and it made her upset and miserable that he remembered none of it. As she spent more time going back up to the surface and watching all these people, she wanted to know more about them, and after she had exhausted all her sisters' knowledge of them, she went to her grandmother and she asked the questions that she wanted to know. She asked her grandmother that if men weren't drowned at sea, did that mean that they live forever on the land? Which of course they don't. And that the human lifetimes are shorter than the merfolk lifetimes, as the merfolk lifetimes go upwards to towards 300 years, give or take. But when humans die, they are buried and they have graves. But when merfolk die, they are turned into sea foam, and there is no grave for them. They have no immortal soul, and hence no afterlife. Humans, on the contrary, have an immortal soul which can rise up out of their bodies into the heavens, and they can see sights that merfolk would never ever see. You do get the whole heaven and belief and souls running through this, which of course was prevalent more at the time. Now, the Little Mermaid was sad at hearing this, the fact that humans didn't live forever, as are we all, and asked why merfolk were not also given an immortal soul. And she said that she would gladly give up her 300 years as a mermaid if she could have but one day as a human and then have an immortal soul die and go up to heaven to see the clouds. Her grandmother told her not to be so stupid and that the sights on land were nowhere near as good as the life down below the sea, which I think is a line by Sebastian in the first one. Now, the Little Mermaid lamented that she must also die and turn into foam on the waves and see neither the flowers, nor the sun, nor the heavens, nor anything ever again. And wasn't there anything that she could do? She's 15. She's a bit dramatic. Now, when the mermaid asked, was there anything that she could do, I'm just going to read what her grandmother's response was, because it's very important. Unless a human being loved you so much that you meant more to him than his mother and father, if his every thought and his whole heart cleaved to you so that he would let a priest join his right hand to yours and would promise to be faithful here and throughout all eternity, then his soul would dwell in your body, and you would share in the happiness of mankind. He would give you a soul and yet keep his own, but that can never come to pass. The very thing that is your greatest beauty here in the sea, your fishtail, would be considered ugly on land. They have such poor taste that to be thought beautiful there, you have to have two awkward props, which they call legs. Now, on hearing this, the Little Mermaid sighed and looked unhappily at her fishtail. Now, her grandmother was getting quite annoyed with her at this point and said to just let us be happy. They have 300 years to be happy and alive and joyous, and surely, isn't that enough? After that amount of time and that amount of life, they will gladly be turned into sea foam and be carried along the waves to their... Now, that night there was a great party in the Sea King's palace, and the Little Mermaid sang more sweetly than anyone there, and everyone applauded her, and for a moment she was truly happy as she looked around at all the applause and praise she was getting, and she knew that she had the loveliest voice in all the ocean. But her thoughts strayed back to the world above, and the handsome prince had not been able to hear her wonderful voice, and if he had heard her wonderful voice, he would want to give up his soul. She snuck out of the ball and she went to go sit in her garden. And suddenly she heard a bugle call through the water, which meant that her beloved was back on a ship and sailing on the sea. And she knew in that instant that she loved him more than she loved her mother and father, more than she loved her 300 years, and she made up her mind that while everyone was distracted with the party, she was going to go and visit the Sea Witch, as she would be the only one who could possibly help her. The little mermaid set out towards the whirlpools which raged in front of the witch's dwelling. No flowers grew there, it was bare and it was grey and it was dangerous. Like roaring mill wheels, the whirlpools snatched everything that they could and took them down far beneath the sand of the ocean floor. She had to thread her way through these whirlpools very carefully, and then for a long stretch through a hot lava mire. And beyond this hot marsh lay the witch's house in the middle of a strange forest, where all the trees and shrubs were polyps, which was half animal, half plant, and their branches were long slimy arms that reached towards whatever they could get hold of, and they twined around and they wouldn't let go. Now, when the little mermaid came upon this, she was terrified, as you would be if you imagined having to go through this, and she almost made to turn back. However, the thought of her handsome prince and finally being with him on land made her continue. She bound her hair up so the polyps couldn't grab at it, and she darted through as fast as she could. She saw that every one of the polyps had caught something. White bones of men who had perished at sea and sank, ship rudders, treasured objects, animal skeletons, and the most ghastly of all that she saw was a little mermaid who they had caught and strangled. She finally reached a clearing where thick white snakes slithered over everything, and in the middle of the clearing was a house built of the bones of shipwrecked men, and there, in this house, sat the sea witch, letting a toad eat out of her mouth like a baby bird does from its mother. Now I'm going to read this interaction directly from the book because it can be quite sinister. So when the witch sees the little mermaid, she says, "I know exactly what you want. It's very foolish of you, but just the same you shall have your way, for it will bring you to grief, my proud princess. You want to get rid of your fishtail and have two props instead, so that you can walk about like a human creature and have the young prince fall in love with you, and win him and an immortal soul besides." And at this point, the witch gave such a loud cackling laugh that the toad and the snakes were shaken to the ground, where they lay writhing together. "You are just in time," said the witch. "After the sun comes up tomorrow, a whole year would have to go by before I could be of any help to you." She doesn't explain a reason for that either. "I shall compound you a draught, and before sunrise you must swim to the shore with it, seat yourself on dry land, and drink the draught down. Then your tail will divide and shrink until it becomes what the people on earth call a pair of shapely legs. But it will hurt. It will feel as if a sharp sword slashed through you. Everyone who sees you will say that you are the most graceful human being they had ever laid eyes on, for you will keep your gliding movement, and no dancer will be able to tread as lightly as you. But every step you take will feel as if you were treading upon knife blades, so sharp that blood must flow. I am willing to help you, but are you willing to suffer?" And the little mermaid thought of the prince and what she would gain, and said yes. "Now remember," said the witch, "once you have taken a human form, you can never be a mermaid again. You can never come back through the waters to your sisters or to your father's palace. And if you do not win the love of the prince so completely that for your sake he forgets his father and mother, cleaves to you with his every thought and his whole heart, and lets the priest join your hands in marriage, then you will win no immortal soul. If he marries someone else, your heart will break on the very next morning, and you will become foam of the sea, and you will be no more." And the little mermaid said, "She'll take that risk." "Also, you'll have to pay me," said the witch, "and it's no trifling price that I'm asking. You have the sweetest voice of anyone down here at the bottom of the sea, and while I don't doubt that you would like to captivate the prince with it, you must give this voice to me. I will take the very best thing that you have in return for my sovereign draught. I must pour my own blood in it to make the drink as sharp as a two-edged sword." And the little mermaid asked, But if you take her voice, what will be left to her? Your lovely form, the witch replied. Your gliding movements and your eloquent eyes. With these you can easily enchant a human heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Stick out your tongue and I shall cut it off. I'll have my price and you shall have the draft. Which Disney most included word for word in the Poor Unfortunate Souls song. And I think they only changed the cutting out of the tongue for the removal of the voice box. Because it is a kids' film after all. Now the witch hung her cauldron over green flames and cut herself so that her black blood dripped into the bottom of it, where it steamed and made sinister shapes. The witch constantly threw new ingredients into the cauldron and it started to boil. And when it was ready, it looked as clear as the purest water. The witch offered the draught to the mermaid and cut out her tongue with the other hand. And now she could neither talk nor sing. And when the little mermaid left, the polyps which had been so eager to grab her when she was on the way to the witch's house shrank back from her in fear. Now when she traversed back through the hot marsh and the woods and the whirlpools, she could see her father's palace glinting in the distance, and she dared not go near it now that she had no voice, no song, no tongue, essentially. She felt as though when she was looking at it that her heart was breaking, and she blew kisses towards the windows as if to say goodbye. And she rose to the surface through inky blackness in the dead of the night. When she rose up towards the surface, she saw the prince's palace bathed in moonlight, and she swam to the marble staircase and dragged herself up on them so that not one bit of her was touching the water. And it was there that she drank the witch's potion, which was bitter and fiery, and immediately she felt as though a sword was slicing through the middle of her, all the way down to her tail. And the mermaid fainted dead away at the excruciating pain the moment it hit. The next day, when the sun's rays were warm on her face, she awoke. She found her prince standing over her, gazing at her with his beautiful dark eyes. Lowering her gaze, she saw that her tail was gone, and in its place she had the loveliest pair of white legs that anybody could wish for. But she was naked completely, and she disguised herself with her long flowing hair. Now the prince asked her who she was and how she came to be upon his steps in the dead of night, looking like she'd just been shipwrecked. But of course she had no tongue and she could not answer him. He took her hand, for he was kind, and guided her into the palace, and every step she took was like standing on a knife blade. But everyone who saw her commented on how graceful she walked. Once she was dressed in the silk clothes that were given to her, everybody announced that she was the most beautiful girl in all the palace. And that afternoon, when beautiful servants came to sing in front of the prince and his parents, the king and queen, one of them sang more sweetly than the rest, and the prince smiled and clapped at her, and the little mermaid felt unhappy or jealous, because she knew that had she had her tongue, she would have blown them out of the water, no pun intended, and her voice sounded much, much better than the one that they were praising right now. The little mermaid charmed everyone she met, especially her prince, who called her his dear little foundling. I know that if I met the love of my life and he called me a dear little foundling, he wouldn't be the love of my life for very long. But she's 15. They danced together again and again, and her dancing was very, very graceful, but all the while, every dance step she took, every time she was twirled, she felt like she was walking on razor blades. The prince declared that he would keep her around always, and she was given a velvet pillow and instructed to sleep outside of his bedroom door. So she gives up her family, she gives up 300 years, she gives up her tail, she has to walk on razor blades, and she doesn't even get a bed. Talk about a bad bargain. The prince and the mermaid were inseparable, and they went everywhere together. They explored mountains, went up rivers, they went horse riding, they went to the towns, and she was very happy. But every night she went down the marble steps to the sea to cool her feet in the water and think about those that she had left behind. Now one night her sisters came by hand in hand, and they were singing so sadly about how much they missed her. And far out on the waves she could see her grandmother and her father, the Sea King. They couldn't come to her, and she could not go to them. Now as the days went by, she became more and more dear to the prince, and he loved her. But he loved her as one would a child or a sibling. The thought of making her his queen never once entered his head. But she knew that she had to be his wife, or she would never gain an immortal soul. Not to be his wife because she loved him. The soul was always the end goal, it wasn't him. She loved him as well, but when he hugged her, he kissed her forehead. Never anywhere else except her forehead, as you would a small child. She willed her eyes to ask him, "Don't you love me best of all?" And the prince kept telling her how dear she was to him, and how he knew that she loved him more than anyone else in the world, and that she looked so much like the girl who had saved him on the beach. I mean, that's got to be a gut punch. Really. He knew, he's a bit of a dick, to be quite honest. He knew that she loved him more than anyone else, but he just did not feel the same way at all. And he tells her that the only girl that he would fall in love with was the girl who saved him on the beach. Which of course was her, but he had no recollection of her, just the one who came from the temple on the beach and who he saw only twice while he was recovering. But the little mermaid looked so much like her that he was willing to settle for the next best thing to the one in the temple that he could never have. Like I said, he's a bit of a dick. Now, the Little Mermaid was very distressed whenever he brought this up, and he brought it up a lot. And she was very distressed at the fact that he didn't remember that it was her that had saved him from the stormy waves, her that had swam all night with him, keeping his head above the water, who had laid him out on the beach, saved his life. She watched the girl come to rescue the prince, who the prince thinks had saved his life, when it was in fact her hiding in the rocks with seaweed in her hair. She sighed with sorrow because she couldn't cry, but she did take solace in the fact that because the girl belonged to the temple, she would never be able to marry the prince. So she would stay with the prince, ultimately being settled for, and she would give him her life, she would care for him, love him, whatever he wanted. Now, sometime later, rumours began circling that the prince was to marry the daughter of a neighbouring kingdom, and a magnificent ship was being built to transport the prince to said kingdom so that he could marry the girl and bring her back. Now, the Little Mermaid treated all these rumours with a sniff of contempt because she knew the prince better than anyone, and she knew that he loved her better than anyone, barring the girl that was in the temple who he couldn't have. Now, the prince told her that he was being forced to make this journey to the neighbouring kingdom to meet this unknown princess, as it was his parents' wish, but they were taking into consideration what his feelings would be on the matter, and he wouldn't be made to marry against his will. And he would never be able to love this princess as much as he loved the mermaid, and if he had to choose a bride, he would sooner choose his dear little foundling with her beautiful eyes. Then he kissed her mouth, stroked her hair, and rested his head against the mermaid's heart, so that the mermaid felt herself filling up with happiness at the thought of an immortal soul and a life spent with the prince by her side. As they both walked onto the brand new ship which was made for the occasion of the prince going to this neighbouring kingdom, the prince didn't want her to be afraid of the sea, And so he told her stories of the deepest sea creatures, of storms and shipwrecks, and the mermaid smiled at him, but of course nobody knew what was in the deepest sea better than she did. That night, when everyone was asleep and the ship was sailing on the sea, she crept out of the cabin and looked overboard, and she fancied herself that she could see her father's palace deep below and her sisters below the waves, and she waved to them to let them know that she was all right. Now, the next morning, the ship came to this kingdom's harbour, and a crowd was gathered to welcome the prince and his entourage, but the princess was not there. They said that she was travelling from where she had been sent to be educated and would arrive later that day. Now, the Little Mermaid was curious to see this beautiful princess, as you would be to see a love rival, and she had to grant that she was the most beautiful princess that she had ever seen, barring herself. Her skin was clear and fair, and her deep blue eyes were smiling and devoted as she looked at the prince and as he looked back at her. The prince suddenly cried out in recognition as he recognised that the princess that he had just met was the girl from the temple at the beach who had saved his life, and he was so happier than any man had any right to be in that moment. And he grabbed hold of the Little Mermaid's hands and swung her around in pure happiness, elated that he had finally met the one which he was in love with. And the Little Mermaid kissed his hands and smiled sadly up at him, and felt her heart begin to break, for she knew if he married this princess that he was so in love with, then she would be no more. All the church bells in the kingdom rang out, and the prince and princess joined their hands, and the bishop blessed their marriage. The Little Mermaid was dressed in gold and held the princess's train as a bridesmaid, but she was deaf to all the bells, all the singing, all the music and the ritual. Her only thoughts were consumed with her last night upon the earth and losing everything and everyone she had in the world. For a man. Now, that evening, when they boarded the celebratory ship again to take the prince and princess back to their new kingdom now that they were married, the lanterns were lit and the ship looked as it had when the Little Mermaid first saw it on that first night of her birthday all those days ago. This is just a series of days. I think in the Disney film there was like 3. Now, the Little Mermaid joined in the dancing, even though it felt as though she was stepping on razor blades every time her feet touched the ground. But this was her last night, and she wanted to make the most of it, and she really did enjoy the dancing. It was the last night that she would be able to spend with her prince, for whom she had forsaken her home and her family, who she had sacrificed her lovely voice for, and who she had suffered constant torment while he remained completely oblivious. And while she was dancing, she looked towards her prince, and she saw her prince kiss his bride, and she saw his bride play with his lovely black hair, and she watched as they both retired to the wedding pavilion, and she felt her heart break that much more, because she knew he would never be hers. As the night drew on, only the Little Mermaid remained on deck, looking out to the sea, watching the waves. Then she saw her sisters rise from the depths of the ocean. All their lovely hair had been mercilessly hacked off, as they had given it all in payment to the Sea Witch, in exchange for a dagger. The Sea Witch gave them this dagger and instructed them that before the sun rose, the Little Mermaid had to strike the blade into the prince's heart and let his blood flow over her feet, and it would only be then that her legs would be turned back into a mermaid tail and her life could continue as it was before without her turning into sea foam. And she would return to live at her father's palace with her family, with her sisters, and live out her 300 years as she was meant to do. Her sisters implored her that she had to do this before the sun rose, that their grandmother was so grief-stricken that her hair was falling out and her health was failing, and the court just was not the same without the beautiful Little Mermaid with the sweet singing voice. It does not mention that she gets her tongue back, if she does it. by the way. They implored her to kill the prince and come back to them, and then they sank beneath the waves. Now the little mermaid had the dagger in hand, and she went to the pavilion and parted the curtains. She saw her prince and his bride wrapped in each other's arms, soundly asleep. The mermaid went up to him, bent down, kissed his forehead. She looked out of the window and she saw that the clouds had begun to redden and that sunrise would not be far away. She looked at the knife as she turned it over and over in her hands, contemplating whether she could actually do this. And the prince, in his sleep, said the name of his bride. Now, it would be at that moment where I would plunge it right into his heart. But it was at that point that the knife trembled in the mermaid's hands and she flung it far away from her into the water, and she felt her eyes begin to glaze over, and she looked one last time at her handsome prince sleeping so soundly with his bride, and then she flung herself over the side of the ship, and as she touched the water she felt her body dissolve and she became sea foam. But as the sun's rays fell on the now disintegrated body of the mermaid and the sea foam which she had turned into, she looked up and saw that the air was filled with elemental beings, and their voices were so musical that no human or anyone or other creature could hear them except for her. And the little mermaid found that she wasn't actual foam. She was rising out from the water to be with these ethereal beings. She asked them who they were and found that her voice was as musical as hers. They answered that they were the daughters of the air, and that a mermaid could not win an immortal soul without the love of a human, without some higher power granting it to them, and that her eternal life depended on a power outside of herself and anyone's comprehension. God, essentially. And that the daughters of the air did not possess an immortal soul either, but that they could earn one by doing good deeds. And the little mermaid's suffering and loyalty had earned her the chance that she could earn one for herself without having to rely on anyone else or anyone else's love to get one for her. And for the first time, the little mermaid turned her face towards the sun and felt tears run down her face. And on the ship below, she saw that the prince and princess were stirring and were going about on deck looking for her, and eventually they were gazing into the water as if they knew that she had thrown herself overboard. He might have had an inkling. Princess might have had an inkling. Let's face it. You know when somebody unseen and unfelt. The little mermaid flew down and kissed the princess's forehead and the prince's mouth, and rose up with the other daughters of the air into the golden clouds, where she remained doing good deeds. And that is the extremely sad and tragic original tale of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. It's still one of my favourites. Even this version is still one of my favourites. But let me know what your thoughts are. Drop me a comment down below on what you think of the new film, what you think of the original tale. As always, drop a like and a subscribe as well as a comment, because I like to know what you think of these videos. And as always, keep reading.